Hello and welcome to episode 137 on the Everyday Joy podcast. So good to be here with you. My goodness, the Facebook group is thriving. I've got more emails to respond to than ever before, and I'm so grateful. I'm so thankful. I'm also really excited about this little offshoot. So Selena, when the first episode sort of came out with the Everyday Joy podcast, she was saying to me that she really wanted to have a small group that unpacked the episodes together. And then a few weeks later, she emailed me and said, we are actually launching a small group with all these people who love listening into the podcast. And then recently she sent through an email with an update on the group. She said, our Everyday Joy Bible study group is still going and still thriving, and friendships have strengthened, and the Holy Spirit is certainly working on all of us. Praise be to God. My goodness, I am so excited. I'm so happy that this podcast and our conversations are enriching other people's lives. But I also have to say, how good is God? This podcast, this community didn't exist a year ago, but I'm hearing so many incredible stories of how God is using our stories, our experiences, our learning journey to bless so many others. And if you have been impacted in a positive way by this podcast, if there was an episode that really resonated with you or a topic that brought you a lot of healing and understanding, I would love to hear from you. And the email address is in the link below. Right now, though, let's get into today's Bible verse on the Everyday Joy podcast.
Jesus said, do not take revenge on someone who wrongs you. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, let them slap your left cheek also. Matthew 5, verse 39 from the Good News Translation.
I have got George here with me all of this week on the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm so excited about today's episode, George, because the last two episodes where we talked about Matthew 10:42 and Mark 11:25 form a really good foundation for today's verse, because this verse, in all honesty, George, has always confused me a little because it talks about allowing someone to slap you on the right cheek. But I also know that there's more to this verse than meets the eye, and I'm so excited to unpack this verse with you. So could you share a little bit of context first around this verse?
Yeah, so I think the context for this one is actually really important. And yes, I know I'm a broken record with that, Joy. I'm always like, hey, the context is really important. But especially for this verse, I think that's the case, because I think it is, as you say, quite easy to misunderstand this verse. And it's potentially even a little bit dangerous if we do that. Jesus is not saying that you can never defend yourself when you are physically attacked. Bible scholars, experts in this stuff, they say that when he talked about being slapped on the face like this, his original audience, the people listening to him on that day, they would have assumed that he was talking about being insulted, not actually attacked in a physical way.
Right, so those words used in that sentence would have been synonymous or would have held the same meaning as someone insulting you.
Yeah, that's what they would have understood it to have meant. So it's like
So just to get my head around it, if someone was to say, yeah, she was spewing venom at me, it would be like, oh yeah, well, we understand that to be insulting.
Someone's dissing you, someone's having a go at you, but it's more kind of probably more a verbal thing rather than a physical thing in this case.
Right. Okay. Well, that already changes the context of this verse. So, George, what does this verse? First of all, your first impressions of this, bearing in mind the context, but also what does this verse tell you about who God is or what matters to Him?
Well, I think it's a really important idea because if you think about it, even if this verse isn't about actual physical violence and it's more about insults, it's important how we respond to those. And it's not easy to do, right? I mean, that's still really difficult. But if you think about why we should respond to insults in this way, and this is where what it tells me about God question comes into it, I think we need to respond in that way because that's the way that God Himself operates. And if you're a Christian, you are called to reflect God in the way that you live. So this reminds me that God Himself responds to insults in this way. This is what we have seen Him do in the person of Jesus. That's the way He responds. So if we're thinking about what it tells me about God, it tells me, it reminds me that this is what God Himself does. He's given us the model here.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes back to the last few verses that we've looked at. All the 3 verses we've looked at over the last 3 days have started with 2 words. Jesus said. Jesus said, give a cool cup of water. Day before yesterday's Jesus said, do not take revenge. Yesterday, Jesus said, when you stand and pray. And today, Jesus said, do not take revenge. And Jesus did all of those things himself as well. So we see this really powerful pattern of God's asking us not to do something that he wouldn't do himself.
Yeah, exactly. I'm nodding away as you say that, Joy, because I think you've nailed it. It's not just what he taught, it's also what he modeled, right, when he lived here on earth. I mean, we've been talking about the specific insults thing in this episode. Jesus was called horrible names. He was criticized by people. He suffered a whole lot of insults. But what did he do? He turned the other cheek. He actually lived this out. And perhaps in an ultimate sort of way, he modeled this when he died. You know, he was mocked and he was insulted at the time of his crucifixion. But he prayed forgiveness for those who had put him there. Like, he didn't try to get even. He didn't insult them back. So, as always, he's the ultimate example for us to follow.
And have you had a time in your life, George, where you've had to live this out, to not take revenge on someone, to allow God perhaps to deal with the situation rather than you yourself stepping in and dealing with it?
Yeah, and to be honest, it feels a little bit vulnerable to share what I'm about to, because this is actually a live issue in my own life. It's not something which has played out in the past. It's actually something I'm faced with right now. So I'm not going to go into the specific details and the people involved, but there is a situation in my life where a couple of people who I thought would be supportive of me with something, who I thought I could probably rely on, they have sort of acted and been acting in the opposite way, really. And they've actually indicated that I don't have their support to other people, which has honestly, Joy, it's felt pretty gutting. But what I am trying to do, and again, this is a real life thing for me to work on right now, but what I'm trying to do is to remember how Jesus himself responded to insults. We were saying that he was called horrible names, he was criticized people, but he turned the other cheek. And I'm not, of course, saying that my situation is anything like his. I wouldn't want to come here and say, oh, you know, I can compare my sufferings to those of Christ. But actually what I am faced with right now, it does still hurt in a very real way. It is something I'm finding difficult, but I'm looking to Jesus. I'm trying to draw inspiration from his example, and I'm asking God for help with this.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you, George, so much for sharing that, because it's tough talking about something that you're still in, and that you still have to face every day. I know that there'll be a lot of listeners who can relate to what you're going through right now. There's someone or a group of people in your case who've acted in a way that's been really hurtful, and you're trying really hard to just trust in God and take that next right step. When you have, those wayward thoughts of, oh, I just want to send that email, or I just want to send that text, or want to have that conversation, when you feel that push to do something, to act, and I know that there's someone listening right now who's maybe on the cusp of making a decision of sending that text, sending that email, and sorting things out themselves. What do you do in those moments? And what would be a way forward for someone who might be on the cusp of taking matters into their own hands?
I think the first thing to say is that it's okay to feel that way. I mean, if you're anything like me, you kind of know what the right response in a situation is. You know what the good Christ-like thing to do is, and whatever thing you're faced with. And sometimes then you kind of feel bad that you're like, oh gosh, I keep struggling with this, and I'm having some not very Christian thoughts towards this person. Actually, I think that's okay. God isn't shocked, he isn't appalled. He's like, oh, I can't believe George thought that again. He's already prayed to me about this, and here he is having those thoughts again, sort of thing. But he's our loving Father. He gets it. So what I'm trying to do personally in this situation, and I guess if I had any advice to share, it would just be simply to try the same thing. Just keep coming back to God. Tell him how you're feeling. Be honest and ask for his help, and you might just be surprised.
As we wrap up today's verse, I want to touch on 2 things. The first thing I want to touch on is the context around this verse. This scripture is not endorsing physical abuse. Just going to put it out there. It's not saying allow yourself to be hurt in that way again. And so that's something I definitely just want to mention, and go back and listen to that part of the episode today where George unpacks that. The other thing I want to mention is the fact that we have a God who has walked through this experience. Jesus' disciples let him down many times. Jesus was insulted by people in the religious space who should have been his greatest advocates. Jesus was constantly persecuted, constantly let down, but he also provides us a way in which to respond. And this is what Jesus said about it. He said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 39, "Do not take revenge on someone who wrongs you. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, let them slap you on your left cheek too." What he's saying is don't invest your precious time and precious energy on taking revenge. A few episodes ago, we did actually cover this topic with Gig. She had some great thoughts around the wrath of God and leaving room for the wrath of God, leaving room for God to deal with things in his way. And that is episode 128, titled My Version of Justice. And we go into that idea deeper there. But to wrap up today's conversation with a big, pretty bow. It hurts when we feel insulted and let down. But we shouldn't allow that to rob us of all that God has in store. And lastly, we have a God who we can go to. Sometimes we can get really focused on solving the problem, on fixing the relationship, fixing the situation. My application point for you today is this: what can you do? There's a lot of things that we might feel like we ought to do, but what are the things that are actually in your control? What are the things that you can focus on that are beneficial to you and help you grow in your relationship with God? Hey, turn around and bless someone else. If someone's insulted you, pay someone a compliment today. Maybe for you, that means spending more time in worship and prayer and getting your heart right before God. A couple episodes ago, we were talking about forgiveness and entering into the prayer space with a cleansed heart. So maybe that's something you can do today. Bottom line, it's tough, but there is a way forward when you are insulted. Well, that wraps up today's episode on the Everyday Joy podcast. If you'd like to send through an email like Selena, the email address is in the inbox below. George will be wrapping up the week tomorrow, and I look forward to it right here on the Everyday Joy podcast.